Hello everyone, welcome back into the studio for more mold making. This time using plaster to make a solid mud mold shell over a clay portrait that's been covered with flexible silicone rubber already. This is the second part in this video series, so if you're confused about what happened before this point, go back and watch part 1. In the attempt of casting something, we need a negative shape to cast into. It's easier if this negative shape is flexible, since then the negative shape, the mold, can be removed without great difficulty and without damaging either mold or cast. That's why we chose to use silicone. But silicone is soft and floppy, and without something to support it, we would end up with a very distorted casting of our original sculpture. This is where the mother mold comes into play. It's called a mother mold because it cradles the silicone like a mother cradles a baby and makes sure that the silicone retains the shape of the sculpture. The tools and materials we'll be using here today are laid out for you before you on the table. Let's start with the tools. We're going to be using brushes. Any disposable brush will do. Do not use a nice brush that you're afraid to lose because the plaster will ruin it. Metal spatulas in different shapes and sizes are used for sculpting in the plaster. We use metal tools because they are durable and the plaster can be removed from them without damaging the tool itself. Stanley rasps for rasping away dry plaster. Tub of Vaseline to make sure plaster doesn't stick to plaster when we make multiple pieces against each other. And rubber bowls to mix plaster in, of course. The materials on the table are going to be burlap, weave, and plaster. Any mold making or casting plaster should work just fine. It's a good idea to pre-cut the burlap before beginning so that all your materials are ready to go and all you need to do and worry about is working. There's also going to be a bucket of water on the ground below the camera, which is about half full, that I will use to clean brushes and spatulas and my hands in when I get plaster on them. Let's talk about mixing plaster. There is a really simple and fairly idiot-safe way of mixing plaster that I prefer to use and prefer to teach. It works great and you should always mix plaster exactly the same way. There is no switching up the mix ratios, for example, or anything like that. Always put plaster powder into the liquid when it comes to plaster. Never do it the other way around. The bowl is about 1/3 filled with water. A half full bowl is going to overflow once we put plaster powder into it. So we put 1/3 filled with water, just to make sure the plaster doesn't go above the rim of the bowl. Then we sift the plaster powder into the rubber bowl slowly. We let the plaster sink to the bottom before adding more plaster. Sift slowly and gently to make sure the plaster spreads evenly in the water. Don't dump it all into one place. Keep adding plaster powder until the powder appears on the surface as this little island. Try to spread this little island evenly across the surface as well. You can do the same thing no matter the size of the bowl or batch of plaster that you're mixing. With this technique, you'll get strong plaster with good working time and it will go through all the stages we would like the plaster to go through in order for us to do the work at an appropriate time with enough time per stage to do what we need to do. And more on those stages will be coming later. We use rubber bowls because they are flexible, which means once the plaster sets up, we can easily get it out of the bowl by flexing the bowl. You can often find bowls like this in places that sell to art restorers or sometimes at art stores, though unless your art store carries some specific stuff for sculpture, it might be a reach. These thick rubber bowls last forever and are very durable, so they're super useful for plaster. Once the plaster powder island has soaked in the water for about a minute or so, you should be able to see that the white powder surface has turned slightly gray. This means that it has been soaked in water. Sometimes it can take a bit longer than that for this to occur, and that's fine. You just have to sit and wait. Plaster that isn't mixed with the water, meaning you don't stir it in the bowl, won't set up, so you can let it sit for quite a while. Not forever, obviously, eventually it will set up, but you can let it sit for about 5 minutes or so. I waited for a bit too short here, which is why I'm having to mix so much. If you wait for long enough, you really don't need, or you shouldn't really need to mix very much at all. More mixing is going to agitate the plaster more and make it set up faster, while at the same time introducing more air bubbles, which is bad, of course. Hot water will also make the plaster set up faster, so I think it's better to use regular cold tap water, unless you intend for the plaster to set up really fast, that is. So as you can see, we have the yellow silicone here and then the clay wall. This clay wall separates the front half into two separate halves again. We do this to make sure that the plaster pieces don't get stuck on the silicone because of overlaps. If it was one piece, it might get stuck since the front piece goes behind the ears, creating overlaps, essentially going on the far side of the horizon when looking straight at the front, if you will. We discussed this thoroughly in the first episode in this series, so you should check that one out if this doesn't seem clear to you. The silicone will flex around the ears, but the plaster won't, and so instead of one, we'll do two plaster pieces for one piece of silicone. Then later, we'll bolt the two plaster pieces together so they function as one, and you'll see that as well, of course. I was working with some new cameras here when I was filming this, so something went sideways at some point, I'm not entirely sure why, and the filming of this first clay wall wasn't captured. There's another clay wall coming up for the back half of the mold, which needed the same treatment as the front in order to come off the silicone, and you'll see in detail how a clay wall is made then, later on in this video. The first layer of plaster is meant to capture the surface detail of our mold, and therefore doesn't need to be very thick. We should make sure that we don't get any air bubbles, or at least as few as we can, and that we brush the material well onto the surface and evenly onto the surface. I'm a little careful around the clay wall since it's clay, and I don't want to get a bunch of brush marks imprinted into the clay wall, so I'm using a light hand here. I'm careful as well to make sure that plaster gets into the tight corner where the clay wall and the silicone meet, as this is a typical place where air bubbles are captured and we get weak spots. The same thing goes for the registration dimples, those negative shapes or holes on the clay wall. These will often get air bubbles captured within them, so I make carefully sure that the plaster gets in there. If you have an area you're worried about capturing an air bubble or making sure the plaster gets in there, or the plaster is struggling to get in there, it is good to just brush a little bit extra. That tends to do the trick. The plaster sometimes separates a bit from the silicone surface, kind of like oil on water or something like that. When that happens, do not freak out, it's pretty normal. Keep brushing plaster all over the surface like you normally would. The thin plaster is going to dry very fast, or at least dry enough, let's say, so that you can start at the top again and brush more plaster on the silicone. And doing this, you should be able to get rid of those areas where the surface tension is messing with the application. You can see I don't have too much of a problem with this right here, and that's because my plaster was thick enough so that it didn't happen, or it makes it harder for it to happen. If the plaster is mixed properly, it should be thick enough to where it won't separate very much on you. If you mix it way too thin, then it can become a serious problem, as the thinner plaster is more likely to separate and not wanting to play nicely. You can also run into issues with it setting up or how hard it eventually ends up setting up, so properly mixing your plaster bowl solves many problems, many potential problems for you. This layer doesn't really need to be very thick, just thick enough so that the white of the plaster covers all of the yellow silicone and that the white of the plaster becomes non-transparent. If you have a spot that's transparent, go over it again. If you let it dry and the plaster is very thin, it can dry a little bit crackled, and sometimes this can become a bit of a problem. It can sort of flake off when you brush more layers on top later, and this can let the next layer, which will be burlap, show through. Usually not the end of the world, but it's better to do things the right way. I'll usually go over everything once and then do so again, adding thickness to the same layer. I try to keep it as smooth as I can, because if it's too rough, the burlap doesn't want to lay down nicely and evenly on the surface. In order to not disturb the still wet first brushed on layer that you just did, when adding thickness, you should dip the side of your brush in the plaster, and instead of brushing, sort of dab plaster onto the surface. This way you won't disturb and mess up or drag the plaster around at all and simply be adding thickness. Now this is a pretty easy way to cause an uneven surface, frankly, which won't be great in regards to the burlap laying down nicely later, but if you're careful you can make it more than enough even. Just try to play it a little bit carefully.